My daughter was 11 years old the first time she looked at me like I was a stranger. I had driven 2 hours to see her for the 40 minutes a court allowed me, and I stood on that porch with a wrapped birthday present in my hands, and Emily came to the door and looked up at me with my own eyes in her face, and she said, in a voice that was not hers, a voice that had been given to her, "I don't want to see you. You didn't want us. Everybody knows what you did." And then she closed the door. And I stood on that porch, 48 years old, holding a birthday present for a child who had just told me I had abandoned her. And I understood that I was being erased, that someone had spent 2 years quietly rewriting my daughter's memory of her own father, and that there was almost nothing on this earth I could do about it, because every single thing I could do would only prove them right. Stay with me, because I stood on that porch for a long time, and then I drove home, and I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, which was nothing. I did not fight her. I did not defend myself to my 11-year-old daughter. I did not tell her what her mother's husband was really doing or why or what he was actually after, and he was after something. There was money underneath all of it. There always is. I went home and I sat down at my kitchen table and I started to write her a letter that I knew she would never be allowed to read. And I wrote her another one the next week. And the next. For 8 years. 941 letters. Every one of them returned or intercepted or thrown away. Every one of them saved. They took my daughter from me and they nearly took her whole inheritance too, and they thought I had simply given up because I never fought back the way they expected. They did not understand what I was doing. I was not surrendering. I was building the only thing that could ever bring my daughter home, which was a record of the truth that would still be there, waiting, on the day she was finally old enough to come looking for it. My name is Ben Archer, and I want to tell you the whole of this story, from the divorce to the day my daughter came back, because there is a specific kind of cruelty in this world that I did not know existed until it happened to me, and I have since learned that it happens to parents everywhere, quietly, invisibly, and that almost nobody talks about it because there is no way to talk about it without sounding exactly like the villain you are accused of being. It is the cruelty of having your child turned against you. Not taken, not harmed, nothing so simple that the world could see it and name it. Turned. Rewritten. Having someone patiently, cleverly, over years, rebuild your child's understanding of who you are until she looks at you with a coldness she cannot even explain, until every memory of you has been quietly re-edited, until your daughter genuinely believes you abandoned her when you never left, when you were fighting for every hour with her that the world would grant you. And the most diabolical part, the thing that makes it almost perfect as a crime, is that it is unfalsifiable from the inside, because any attempt you make to defend yourself becomes evidence for the prosecution. If you argue, you are attacking her mother. If you get angry, you are the angry man they described. If you tell your child the truth about what is being done to her, you are putting a child in the middle of a war between adults, which is the very thing you are fighting against, and you become, in that moment, exactly what they accused you of being. They built me a cage with no door. And I want to tell you how I lived in it for 8 years without becoming the man they said I was, and how the truth finally got out. Let me start before all of it, because you cannot understand what was stolen unless you know what it was. Emily was born on a Tuesday morning in March, and I want to tell you that the moment I held my daughter for the first time was the moment I understood what my life was actually for. I know every father says that. I do not care. It was true and it stayed true. From the beginning, Emily and I had something particular, a wavelength, the thing that some parents and children just have, and we had it from the first week. I was the one who could get her to sleep. I was the one she came to with the important questions. We had our own language, our own jokes, our own rituals. We had a thing we did every single night from the time she was 2 where I would ask her, "What was the best part of your day?" and she would tell me, and then she would ask me the same, and I would tell her, and it did not matter what else had happened in the world. That was the last thing that happened every day, the two of us trading the best parts of our days. We did that for 9 years. And there was a song, a silly made-up song I invented when she was a baby to make her laugh, that she used to demand every night, and she was the only person in the world who knew it, and I want you to remember that song because it comes back at the end of this story and it is the reason my daughter came home. I should tell you where the song came from because it was not anything. That is the point of it. When Emily was about 4 months old, she went through a stretch of 2 weeks where she screamed every night from 7 until 11, and Diane and I were destroyed, and one night at about 2 in the morning, delirious, out of ideas, I was walking her up and down our hallway and I just started singing complete nonsense at her. Made-up words, a made-up tune, something about a bear who lost his shoes and looked for them in increasingly stupid places, and my daughter stopped crying and looked at me. And that was it. That was the whole birth of the thing. It became the song, and I sang it every night for 9 years, and it grew the way those things do. The bear acquired a whole biography, the verses multiplied, she started demanding specific verses, and by the time she was 6 she could sing it with me, and by the time she was 8 she was correcting me if I got a verse in the wrong order. And here is what matters about it. Nobody else on earth knew that song. Not Diane, not really. She'd heard it, but it was never hers. It did not exist anywhere except between the two of us. There was no recording of it. It was, in the most literal sense, the only thing in the world that was only ours. And I want you to understand that when Grant Sheridan set about rewriting my daughter's understanding of her father, he could reach almost everything. He could reach her memories of birthdays. He could reach her memory of why the marriage ended. He could reach her understanding of every canceled weekend. What he could not reach, because he did not know it existed, was a nonsense song about a bear with no shoes that lived in a place inside my daughter where no adult had ever been. And 8 years later, on a floor covered in returned mail, that was the door she came back through. The divorce was not the story. I want to be very clear about that because people always assume the divorce is where the poison starts, and in our case it simply is not true. My marriage to Diane ended the way a lot of marriages end. Not with a monster and a victim, but with two people who had, slowly and without malice, become strangers and who finally admitted it. It was sad. It was not war. We were, for the first year, actually decent to each other about Emily. We had our arrangement. I had her every other weekend and one night a week and half the holidays. And it was not enough, it is never enough, but it worked, and Emily was all right, and Diane and I managed to be civil, and I told myself that we had done the hard thing well, that our daughter would come through it fine. And she would have. That is the part one want you to hold on to through everything that follows. Emily would have been fine. There was nothing wrong with our family that a decent divorce could not have handled. Everything that happened to my daughter after that, all of it, every bit of the damage was manufactured deliberately by someone who wanted something, and it did not have to happen, and that is what makes it not a tragedy but a crime. His name was Grant Sheridan, and he married Diane about 18 months after our divorce was final, and I want to describe him carefully because if you have ever met a man like Grant, you know that the hardest part of explaining him to anyone is that on paper he is wonderful. Grant was a financial advisor, successful, polished, charming. One of those men who has a firm handshake and a warm laugh and remembers your kids' names. He was good to Diane, at least in the visible ways. He was, when I met him, extremely pleasant to me, so pleasant that I remember driving home from that first meeting thinking, well, that could have been much worse. That seems like a decent man. My daughter will be fine. That was the last uncomplicated thought I had for 8 years. Because Grant Sheridan was not a decent man. Grant Sheridan was something I did not have a name for until I had watched him work for years. A man with an absolutely flawless surface and nothing underneath it but appetite, and what he wanted from the very beginning, from before he ever married my ex-wife, was money, and there was a great deal of money attached to my daughter. Let me explain the money, because it is the engine of this entire story and everything makes sense once you know it. My father, Emily's grandfather, was a man who had worked his whole life and done well, quietly, the way that generation did, and he adored Emily, his only grandchild, and when he died 2 years before my divorce, he left the great majority of his estate not to me but to Emily, in a trust to be hers when she came of age. He and I had talked about it and I had agreed with it completely because I did not need it and my daughter would, and because my father was a careful man who wanted his money to skip a generation and land on the child. It was a lot of money. Life-changing money. And here is the part that mattered. While Emily was a minor, that trust had a structure, and the structure involved oversight, distributions for her care and education, and a whole set of decisions that, in the ordinary course of things, the adults around her would have enormous influence over. So if you were a man who wanted to get his hands on a very large trust belonging to a little girl, you would need 2 things. You would need to marry her mother, and you would need her father gone. Not dead. Just gone, discredited, pushed out, removed from her life and from any position of influence, so that you and the mother you had married were the only voices in that child's ear, the only ones guiding, advising, deciding, for the 8 or 9 years before she came of age, and, if you played it perfectly, the beloved and trusted stepfather she would naturally turn to for financial advice on the day the money finally landed. That was the play. That was always the play. Grant Sheridan did not fall in love with a woman who happened to have a daughter with a trust. Grant Sheridan found a trust and married his way toward it. and the only obstacle between him and it was a father who was never, ever going away. So he set about making me go away. And I want to tell you exactly how it was done in detail because I have learned that this is a playbook, that it is done the same way to parents everywhere, and that the only defense against it is recognizing it early, and I did not recognize it early, and it cost me my daughter's childhood. It started so small I did not see it. It started with a change in Diane. My ex-wife, who had been civil, who had been a decent co-parent for a year, began, in the months after Grant came into the picture, to become difficult in small ways. Pickups got complicated. My weekends started to have things scheduled over them, exciting things, wonderful things that Emily desperately wanted to do, so that the choice was always mine. Either I insisted on my time and became the father who made her miss the trip to the water park with her friends, or I gave up my time. I gave up my time. Of course I did. What kind of father makes his 9-year-old cry over a custody schedule? And every time I gave it up, the gap between Emily and me got one day wider, and there was a note in a file somewhere in Grant's mind that said, "Ben canceled again." That is how it starts. Not with a lie. With an arrangement of circumstances that produces a truth they can use. He did not have to tell Emily her father missed her weekend. Her father did miss the weekend. He just built the situation that made me miss it. Then the messages started to go missing. I would call and it would go to voicemail and I would leave a message for Emily and Emily would never get it. I would send a card and it would never arrive. I would agree to a change of plan by text with Diane and then discover later that Emily had been told I had never responded. Small things, deniable things. Any one of them was a normal domestic mix-up, and I remember in those early months apologizing to my own daughter for messages I had definitely left and cards I had definitely sent, because it was easier than making her think her mother was lying, and I could not prove anything, and I still, God help me, thought it was all just chaos and not design. That is the genius of it. Each individual brick looks like an accident. Takes years to see the wall, and underneath the logistics, the real work was being done, and I did not learn the full shape of it until much later. Because what Grant was doing, patiently, expertly, was telling my daughter a story. Never crudely. Never in a way that could be caught. He never said, "Your father is a bad man," because a 9-year-old rejects that, and because it could be reported. What he did was infinitely more sophisticated. He would say, in front of Emily with enormous sympathy, things like, "Don't be too hard on your dad, honey, he's just very busy with his own life and people have to make their choices." He would sigh and look sad, and say, "I wish he could be here for this, but let's not let it spoil your night." He would be so kind about it, so understanding of my failings, that Emily was left with an unmistakable impression that her father was a man who required understanding, a man who was failing her, a man who chose other things over her, and Grant never once said a single sentence that could be quoted against him. And Diane, my ex-wife, who I do not believe started as a villain in this story, said nothing or agreed quietly or looked away, and after a while she began to believe some of it herself, because it is amazing what a person can come to believe when believing it is convenient and someone charming is telling them it is true. And Diane's mother, Lorraine, was the other engine, and I should tell you about her because she was the crudest instrument in the orchestra and in some ways the most damaging. Lorraine had never liked me, not from the first day, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything I ever did and everything to do with Lorraine, and after the divorce she was, at last, free to say what she had wanted to say for a decade, and she said it constantly to my daughter in the direct and stupid way that certain grandmothers can. "He never really wanted a family. He left, didn't he? Your mother did everything and he walked away. That is how it works." A child gets the sophisticated version from Grant and the crude version from Lorraine, and between them they build a story with a shape, and the child, who is 9 and who loves her mother, and who wants desperately to make sense of why her family broke, finds that the story explains everything, and the story is, "My father didn't want us." And I want to say something about why that story is so effective, because I have thought about it for a decade and I think it explains this entire crime. Children are meaning-making machines. When something enormous and frightening happens to a kid, the very worst thing in the world for her is that it be random, that it have no explanation, that her family simply came apart for adult reasons she cannot follow. That is unbearable. A child will accept almost any explanation, including a terrible one, including one that hurts her over no explanation at all. So when a 9-year-old's world breaks in half, and one set of adults hands her a clean, simple, complete story that explains everything, of course she takes it. It is the only thing on offer. And the story they handed my daughter had one more feature that made it irresistible, which is that it made her mother the hero and her father the reason, and she lived with her mother, and she needed her mother to be all right. Kids protect the parent they live with. It is the most natural thing in the world. Emily did not choose Grant's story over mine. She chose the only story anyone gave her, in the house where she slept, from the people who fed her, and I was 2 hours away for 40 minutes a month with no story at all, because I had decided not to tell her one. I have never once blamed her for taking it. I would have taken it too. That is what they counted on. They did not manipulate a bad child. They exploited a good one, which is worse. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you the question I could not answer for 8 years because I still, honestly, do not know if I got it right. When someone is poisoning your child against you, and your child is 9 years old, what are you allowed to do? Because you have a defense. You have the truth. You could sit that child down and say, here is what is happening. Here is who is lying to you. Look at these messages. Look at these dates. Your mother's husband is doing this to you on purpose, and here is why. And you would be telling the truth. And you would also be doing the exact thing they accuse you of, which is putting a child in the middle of a war between adults, forcing a 9-year-old to sit in judgment of her own mother, using your daughter as a battleground. Do you tell her and win and damage her? Or do you stay silent and protect her from the war and lose her? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I have never met another parent in this situation who was sure, and every single one of us lies awake wondering if we chose wrong. I chose silence. For 8 years, I chose silence. I never once told my daughter what was being done to her. I never once said a word against her mother. And I want to tell you why, and then I want to tell you what it cost, and then I want to tell you why it turned out, in the end, to be the only thing that could have saved us. I chose silence because of something my father said to me once, years before, when I was a young man complaining about someone who had wronged me. He said, "Ben, you can win almost any argument if you're willing to become someone your kid wouldn't recognize. The trick is winning as yourself." And I sat at my kitchen table the night Emily closed that door on me, with a birthday present still on the seat of my car, and I understood that Grant Sheridan had built a trap where the only way to fight was to become the man he was describing. If I raged, I was the rager. If I dragged Emily through a war of depositions and evaluations to prove a negative, I was the father who put his daughter through a war. If I told Emily the truth, I was the man who made his little girl choose between her parents. Every road that led to winning led directly over my child, and I would not drive over my daughter to get to my own vindication. So I did the only thing left. I decided that I would simply be, for however many years it took, exactly the father I actually was, over and over, in the face of a story that said I was not, and I would document every second of it, and I would wait. And there is one more thing, the most important thing, the thing they never once suspected, and it is the reason this story does not end the way they planned. My father, Emily's grandfather, had been a careful man. He had built that trust with an attorney named Walter Ross, an old friend, a man of the most rigid and unglamorous integrity you have ever encountered, and my father had done something that I did not fully appreciate until Grant Sheridan came calling. He had made the trust independent. Walter Ross was the trustee, not the mother, not the father, not any future stepfather. A professional trustee with a fiduciary duty to exactly one person on this earth, Emily Archer, with absolute discretion, with no obligation whatsoever to listen to any adult's opinion about anything, and with a mandate to serve that child's genuine interests until she came of age and to hand it to her personally. Then, my father, who died before Grant Sheridan ever existed, had, without ever knowing it, built a wall around my daughter's future that the man who married his way toward her money could not climb, could not charm, and could not go around. Grant spent years being wonderful to Walter Ross. Walter Ross, who was 71 years old and had been charmed by people who wanted money for 50 years, was about as moved by it as a lighthouse is moved by weather. I need to tell you about one conversation I had with Walter in the second year, because it is the decision I am proudest of in my entire life and nobody has ever known about it until now. I went to see him, and I want to be honest about why I went, because my motives were not clean. I went because Walter Ross was the one adult in my daughter's life with total, unimpeachable credibility, a man with a legal duty to her, a man Diane and Grant could not dismiss, a man who saw Emily twice a year for the trust reviews. He was the only line I had into her world, and I sat in his dusty office and I thought about asking him to tell her. Just a little. just to mention in passing at a review that her father asks about her. That her father has never once, in 2 years, requested a single dollar from her trust for his own benefit, which was true. That her father sends letters. Nothing improper. Just a fact or two from a source she would believe dropped where it might grow. And I did not ask him. Instead, I asked him for the opposite, and Walter never forgot it, and he told me years later it was the reason he did what he did at the end. I said, "Walter, I want you to promise me something. If Emily ever asks you about me, tell her the truth. But you are never, ever to bring me up on your own. You don't mention the letters. You don't mention that I ask about her. You don't defend me to her. Ever, not once. Not if she says something terrible about me right to your face, and she will." And Walter took his glasses off, which I would learn over the years was the only thing he ever did that resembled an emotion. And he said, "Ben, why?" And I said, "Because you're the only person in her life who isn't playing her. If you become one more adult trying to move her a certain way, then she doesn't have anybody left. Grant's working her. Diane's working her. Lorraine's working her. If you start working her too, even for me, even with the truth, then every single adult in that child's life is running an angle, and I will not do that to her. She needs one person who is exactly what he says he is. Let it be you. So don't be my friend, Walter. Be hers. That's all I want." And Walter Ross sat there for a long moment, and then he put his glasses back on, and he said, "All right," and he kept it. For 6 more years, that old man sat across from my daughter twice a year and knew everything and knew about the boxes and knew about the investigation and how it ended, and heard her say bitter things about me and never once, not a single time, said a word in my defense. Do you know what that costs a decent man? He told me years later that it was the hardest professional discipline of his career, that there were days he drove home furious, and that he did it because he had understood exactly what I was asking for and had agreed that it was right. And here is why it mattered, and this is the part that still knocks the wind out of me. When Emily was 19 and finally called him with a question, the reason she believed him, the reason his answer detonated 8 years of construction in a single afternoon, was that Walter Ross had spent 6 years never once trying to sell her anything. Every other adult in her life had an angle, and children can smell an angle even when they cannot name it. Walter had no angle. He had never pushed her toward me, never defended me, never dropped a hint. And so when he finally, in answer to her direct question, told her a plain fact about her stepfather, it landed with the weight of the only honest man she had ever met. If I had used him, if I had turned him into my messenger back in year 2 the way I wanted to, he would have been just another voice in the noise, and she would have discounted him exactly the way she discounted everything else that came from my direction. I gave up the only weapon I had. It was the only reason it worked. Let me tell you what those 8 years were actually like. But first let me finish the porch because I left myself standing on it and I have never really left it. After Emily closed that door, I did not knock. I want you to understand why, because it is the whole of my strategy in one moment. Every instinct in my body said knock, say her name, make her look at you, tell her, she is 11, she is right there, 6 feet away, just tell her. And I did not knock because I could see the curtain move, because Grant was in that house. And I understood, standing there with total clarity, that a man who has spent 2 years constructing a story about a father who is not safe, who is angry, who is difficult, would very much like that father to knock on the door and raise his voice on the porch in front of the child. That was not a failure of the plan. That was the plan. The door closing was not the end of the operation. It was the bait. And if I had knocked, if I had raised my voice even slightly, then Emily would have had a memory, a real one, an actual memory of her own, of her father shouting on the porch, and every story they had told her for 2 years would have been retroactively confirmed by her own eyes, and it would have been over forever because you cannot argue with a person's own memory. So I did not knock. I put the present down on the porch, next to the door, and I said, through the door, in a completely normal voice, "That's okay, sweetheart. I love you. Happy birthday." And I walked to my car and I drove around the corner and I pulled over and I sat there for I do not know how long. And here is the detail I have never been able to shake. The present was a book. It was the 4th in a series she had been obsessed with when she was 9, and I had pre-ordered it 11 months earlier, before any of this, back when she still called me, because I had wanted to be the one who gave it to her. It was a signed copy. I had driven 90 minutes to a bookstore on a Tuesday to get it signed for her, and I had written in the front of it in my own hand, and I had wrapped it myself. Nobody in that house knew she had ever cared about those books. And 3 weeks later, I drove past to drop off support paperwork, and the present was in the trash can at the end of the driveway, still wrapped. And I want you to understand that I did not go get it out of the trash, not because of dignity. I have no pride left where my daughter is concerned, but because I understood even then what it would look like if the neighbors saw the father from the story going through the family's garbage. There was no move. There was never a move. Everything I could do, they had already made mean the opposite. That is the cage. That is what it is like. And that book is the reason I know that what happened to my family was not a mistake or a misunderstanding or two adults handling a divorce badly. Because you have to hate somebody quite specifically to throw away a signed book, unopened, that a child would have loved. I showed up. That is the whole of it, and it sounds so small when you say it out loud, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done. I showed up for every single scheduled visit on time every time for 8 years, including all the ones where I drove 2 hours and was told she was sick, or she was at a friend's, or she didn't want to come out, and I turned around and drove 2 hours home. There was a stretch when she was 14 of 11 consecutive scheduled visits where she did not come to the door. 11. That is 5.5 months. That is 22 hours of driving to stand on a porch and be told, through a gap in a door, that she was not coming, and then 22 hours of driving home. And I want to tell you about the drive home because that is the actual texture of this thing, not the dramatic moments. The drive home is where it lives. You have 2 hours. You are alone in a car. And there is nothing to do for 2 hours except construct the argument. That is what your brain does, it cannot help it. You compose in exquisite detail the speech, the one where you finally tell her. You get it perfect. You know exactly which message you would show her first, and exactly what you would say about the water park weekend, and exactly the tone of voice you would use, calm, reasonable, devastating, and you can see her face changing as she understands. You can see the whole thing, and by the time you are 40 minutes from home you have one completely in your head for the 200th time. And then you pull into your driveway and you sit there and you take it apart again, brick by brick, the way you have done 200 times, because you know what actually happens if you give that speech. You know that a 14-year-old who is told her mother is a liar does not thank you. She defends her mother because of course she does, because that is her home, that is where she sleeps, that is the only version of reality she has, and you are a man she sees for 40 minutes a month who has just called her entire life a lie. She would repeat every word of it to Diane within the hour. And Grant would have exactly what he had been fishing for since the beginning, which was me, on the record, in my own words, doing the thing he had been accusing me of. He would have taken that speech straight to a lawyer, and it would have been the last conversation I ever had with my child. Every single time. 200 times. I won the argument in the car and lost my daughter in the driveway, and then I went inside and wrote a letter about a dog I saw. That is what those years were. Not drama. Just the daily, grinding discipline of not doing the thing that would feel like relief. And I want to say something to anybody out there living inside this right now, because I know some of you are. The fantasy of telling them is not a plan. It is a painkiller. It feels like strategy, and it is actually just the ache. Every one of us has that speech memorized. None of us should ever give it. I showed up at the school events I was legally allowed to attend and sat in the back and did not make a scene, and watched my daughter's eyes find me in the crowd and slide away. I want to give you one of those because people hear, I attended her school concert, and they picture something ordinary, and there was nothing ordinary about it. She was 13. She played the clarinet badly with great seriousness, and I had a right to be there because it was a public school event and I was her father and no order on earth said otherwise. And I got there 40 minutes early so that I could sit at the very back on the aisle because I had learned that where I sat mattered. If I sat too close, I was making her uncomfortable. If I stood at the back, I was looming. If I brought flowers, I was staging a scene. There was a correct way to attend my daughter's concert, and it had taken me 2 years of study to find it. And it was, last row, aisle seat, arrive early, leave during the final applause so that there is no possibility of an encounter in the lobby that could be described later. And they came in, the three of them, Diane and Grant and Lorraine, and they sat in the 4th row, and Grant had a video camera. And at some point before it started, Emily came out from the side to talk to them, and Lorraine said something and nodded backward toward me, and I watched my daughter turn and look at me across 150 people. And I did not wave. I had learned not to wave. I just looked back at her, and I did the only thing that was available to me in that room, which was to be visibly, obviously, boringly there. And she turned away. And here is the part one need you to understand, because this is the thing about this crime that nobody who hasn't lived it can imagine. I sat through 45 minutes of a middle school band concert to see my daughter play for 4 minutes. And when she played, she was good. She was so much better than the year before, and I felt my chest come apart with pride. And there was not one single human being in that entire auditorium I could turn to and say, "That's my kid." Not one. Because to everyone in the fourth row, I was the man from the story, and to everyone else, I was some guy sitting alone at the back. The proudest moment of my year, and I had to swallow it whole, alone, silently, in the dark, and then get up during the applause and walk to my car so that nobody would have to see me in the lobby. And Grant filmed every one of those concerts from the fourth row, and I want you to appreciate the elegance of that because those videos exist, and in every one of them, if you knew to look, you would find the same shot. Emily on stage, Grant's warm voice off camera saying her name, and in the far back of the frame, out of focus, a man alone in the last row. He was building an archive too. His archive said, "Here is her family, and here, in the back, is that man." Every video was an exhibit. Mine, in the end, were letters. I sent the birthday presents that came back. I paid every dollar of support, early, always, and kept every receipt, not because anyone was checking, but because I had learned that the one thing they could never manufacture around was a record. And every week, every single week, I wrote her a letter. The letters are the center of this story, so let me tell you what they actually were. They were not arguments. That is the thing I want you to understand, and it is the thing that took me the longest to learn. In the first year, my letters were terrible. They were long, desperate defenses of myself, page after page of "but that's not true." But I did call, "but here's what actually happened." And one night I read one back before sealing it, and I realized I was writing to a child as though she were a jury, and I threw it away, and I sat there a long time, and I understood something that changed everything. She did not need my case. She needed her father. If those letters ever reached her, at 9 or at 19, what she needed to find in them was not a lawyer arguing but a dad talking. So from that night on, I never defended myself again. Not once in 941 letters. I just talked to her. I told her what was happening in my week. I told her the best part of my day, the way we used to, every single letter, because that had been ours and I was not going to let it die just because she could not answer. I told her about the dumb things that happened at work. I told her I loved her and I did not make it heavy. I just said it the way you say it to a kid at breakfast. I asked her what the best part of her day had been, knowing there would be no answer. And I never, not in one single line, said a word against her mother or Grant or Lorraine. Not one, because I decided that if my daughter ever read these at any age, she was not going to find her father tearing her family apart. She was going to find her father, being her father week after week, in the dark, for as long as it took, and I saved them. Every one that came back marked return to sender, I saved in the envelope, unopened, stamped, and dated by the Postal Service, and the ones that were never returned I kept a copy of. I bought a plain cardboard file box and I put them in it in order, and when it filled I bought another, and over 8 years that stack of boxes grew in the corner of my living room, and I want you to picture it because I looked at it every single day. 4 cardboard boxes of letters to a child who did not want them. My friends thought it was the saddest thing they had ever seen. My brother told me once, gently, that it was time to stop, that I was torturing myself, that she was gone. And I told him what I had figured out at that kitchen table, which was that I was not writing to the 11-year-old. I was writing to the 25-year-old. I was writing to a woman who did not exist yet, a woman who would one day, maybe, wonder what had really happened and go looking, and I intended for there to be something there when she looked. That was the entire strategy of 8 years. Not to win her back, to be findable. Now let me tell you what they did, because while I was writing letters, Grant was escalating, and it got very bad. The turning point came when Emily was 12, and I want to talk about it carefully because it is the single most serious thing in this story and I refuse to be careless with it. Grant made a report. He and Diane went to the authorities and alleged that Emily was frightened of me, that she had said things, that there were concerns about her well-being in my care. And I want to stop right here and say something as clearly as I know how, because it matters more than any part of my own story. The systems that exist to protect children from harm are among the most important things our society has ever built. They exist because real children are really harmed, and those systems save lives every single day, and the people who work in them do one of the hardest jobs there is. Nothing in my story is a criticism of the existence of those protections, and I would rather live in a world where 100 fathers like me are investigated than in one where a single genuinely frightened child is ignored. What Grant did was not an indictment of the system. What Grant did was a crime against it, because when a person makes a false report to gain an advantage in a custody fight, they are not just attacking the other parent, they are stealing the credibility of every real report. They are burning the resources of the people whose actual job is finding the children who are truly in danger, and they are teaching a child that a system built to protect her is really just a weapon her adults use on each other. That is the real evil of it, and it is why I have never in 8 years said one word against the investigators who came to my door. They were doing their job. They were doing it because someone lied to them. So they came and they investigated, and I want to tell you what those weeks were like, being a decent man under that particular cloud, because I do not think most people can imagine it. There is no clearing your name from that, not really, not fully, not in the eyes of a neighborhood, because the accusation is the punishment. People I had known for years stopped meeting my eye. And the thing that nearly destroyed me was not the fear of what would happen to me. It was picturing my 12-year-old daughter in a room with a stranger being asked careful questions about her father, and knowing that she had been prepared for that room by 2 adults who wanted something, and knowing that whatever she said in there, she was going to carry it. He did that to her. Not to me, to her. That is the part one have never been able to forgive, and I am a fairly forgiving man. He put my child in that room to get at a trust fund, and it collapsed. It collapsed completely because it was false, and because the professionals who looked at it were good at their jobs, and because I had 8 years of the most obsessively documented life in the county. I want to be honest that this is where my strategy of documentation, which had felt for years like the futile hobby of a broken man, turned out to be the thing that saved my life, because when they came, I did not have to say trust me. I had a schedule log going back years showing that I had appeared for 100% of my scheduled visits. I had the returned letters, dated by the government itself. I had every text message, every support payment receipt, every canceled visit and the reason given and by whom. When you have a wall of contemporaneous, third-party dated records, and the other side has a story, the wall wins. The investigation was closed, unfounded, and there is no version of that word that gives you back what those weeks take out of you, but it was over, and the record of it existing, and of how it ended, went into my boxes with everything else, because I had a feeling even then that one day it would matter. Here is what I did not do, and this is the moment in the story where I think most people would have done differently, and where I still, some nights, wonder. I did not counterattack. My lawyer wanted to. He wanted to go back to court, to use the unfounded finding, to seek sanctions, to seek a change of custody, to bring the whole apparatus down on Diane and Grant, and I believe then and believe now probably win something. And I said no. And the reason I said no was not weakness, and it was not because they deserved mercy, because they deserved nothing of the kind. It was because my lawyer explained to me exactly what that fight would look like, and it would look like my daughter, now 12, being interviewed again, evaluated again, deposed maybe, put in the middle again, made to carry the war for another 2 years while the adults fought about her over her head. He said, "We can win, Ben," and I asked him, "What does she look like at the end of it?" And he was an honest man, and he said, "Honestly? Damaged." And I said, "Then no," because I finally understood the actual shape of the thing that had been done to me, which was this. They had made my daughter the hostage, and every weapon I had was pointed through her. The only way to hurt them was to hurt her, and I would not do it. I want to be honest that this decision felt, at the time, like the choice of a coward, and that I drove home that day and sat in my car in the driveway and cried like I have never cried in my life, because I had just, in the eyes of the entire world, let them win. But I had done the only calculation that mattered. There was no version of victory that got me my daughter back, because you cannot win a person. All I could do was make sure that when she came looking, the man she found had not, in her absence, become the monster she'd been told about. Now let me tell you about the money, because this is where their whole scheme broke, and they never saw it coming. They came for the trust when Emily was 13, and they came for it hard, and it is the clearest proof of what the whole thing was always about. With me pushed out, with the alienation complete, with a closed investigation on the record that they could gesture at, Grant made his move on Walter Ross. And it was, I will admit, well constructed. There were proposals. There was a plan to move a substantial portion of Emily's trust into investments that Grant would advise on, for her benefit, of course, with his professional expertise at a friendly rate, of course. There were requests for large distributions for Emily's care and enrichment that were, when you looked at the numbers, distributions for the household's care and enrichment, for the house they lived in and the cars they drove and the lifestyle they had. There was a suggestion, floated delicately, that given the difficult family circumstances and the father's absence, it would be far simpler and more natural for the trust's administration to be moved closer to the family, to a trustee they knew, someone local, someone responsive. And behind all of it was the assumption that had worked on everyone else in Grant Sheridan's life, which was that a warm relationship, patiently built over years, is a lever you can eventually pull. And Walter Ross said no. And this is the part one love. He did not say it angrily. He was not offended. He simply said no in his flat, dry 71-year-old voice, and then he said no again the next time and the next, and when Grant tried a different approach, he said no to that too. Because Walter Ross had exactly one client, and she was 13 years old, and she was not in the room, and he did not work for the adults who were. I asked him once, years later, whether Grant had ever come close, whether the charm had ever gotten any traction at all, and Walter looked at me with genuine puzzlement, like I had asked whether he'd ever considered setting his own office on fire, and he said, "Ben, he wasn't my client. She was. And that is the whole of it. That is the entire difference between a Walter Ross and a Grant Sheridan, and it is the thing my father understood when he built that wall, which is that character is not a thing you can charm and integrity is not a thing you can negotiate with, and that the only real protection you can build for a child is to put the thing they will need one day in the hands of a person who cannot be bought." So Grant got nothing. 8 years, an entire campaign, a marriage, the systematic dismantling of a child's relationship with her father. All of it aimed at a trust that a dead man and a stubborn old lawyer had sealed shut before he ever arrived. He had won the war and captured an empty fortress. And I want you to hold that thought because it explains everything about what happened next and about why Grant Sheridan's own greed finally, at the end, did what 8 years of my patience could not. If you have made it this far, let me ask you the question that 8 years of this taught me to ask. Is there a point at which staying good becomes a kind of failure? Because the world will tell you, and my friends did tell me, and some nights I told myself that a real father would have fought, that my restraint was just surrender with better manners, that I lost my daughter's childhood because I was too principled to get in the mud. And maybe that is true. I have never been certain. But here is the other side, the thing I could not have known at the time and know now. If I had gone to war, if I had dragged her through it, if I had told my 11-year-old the truth about her mother and her stepfather, I would have won a battle in the year she was 12, and I would have lost her for the rest of her life because a child forced to convict her own family does not forgive the parent who forced her. Tell me in the comments where you come down, because I think this is the loneliest question a parent can face, and there are people listening to this right now, tonight, sitting in a car outside a house they are not allowed to enter, who need to hear other people wrestle with it honestly. Stay with me, because Emily turned 18, and everything changed. It did not change the way you are imagining. She did not have a revelation. She did not wake up one morning and see through 8 years of construction, because that is not how any of this works. A person does not simply notice that the walls of the room they were raised in are painted. What happened was smaller and stranger, and it happened because of Grant, not because of me. Because when Emily turned 18, Grant got impatient. And impatience is what finally cracks a man like that. For 8 years he had been perfect, disciplined, never a false step, but for 8 years he had also been getting nothing because Walter Ross was a wall, and now here was Emily, legally an adult, and the trust would vest to her personally at 21, and Grant could suddenly see the end of the tunnel and he could see that he was not in it. Because a trust that hands itself to an adult woman does not need a stepfather. His entire 8-year investment was about to pay out to somebody else. And so he started to hustle her. Gently at first, then not gently. He started managing her, positioning himself as her financial guide, bringing her paperwork, talking about how they should get her set up, get things organized, put some structures in place before the money landed so that it would be handled properly by people who cared about her. He was, in the end, so close to it that he could not keep his hands still, and he began to reach for a 19-year-old signature the way a starving man reaches for bread, and Emily, who had been raised by this man and trusted him completely, began, for the first time in her life, to feel a small cold thing in her stomach that she could not explain. That is all it was. That is the whole crack. Not justice, not truth, not any brilliant move of mine. Just a greedy man who could not wait, and a smart young woman who noticed, for 1 second, that the person who had always been so warm looked a little too hungry. And so Emily did the thing that no one in 8 years had counted on. She went and asked a question. She called Walter Ross. I want to tell you about that conversation because Walter told me about it later, and it is the finest thing I have ever heard about a human being's integrity. Emily, 19, called her trustee to ask, essentially, whether Grant should be handling her money. And Walter Ross, who had been waiting 8 years for this call, did exactly what he had done for 8 years, which was his job, precisely, and nothing more. He did not tell her about her father. Do you understand what that cost him? He had 4 cardboard boxes worth of context in his head. He knew everything. And he did not say a word about it because it was not his to say, because he was her trustee, not her advocate, and because he had promised me. But he answered the question she actually asked. She asked whether Grant should be handling her money, and Walter said, truthfully, that Grant had been attempting to gain access to her trust for 6 years, and that he had records of every one of those attempts, and that it was Walter's professional judgment as her fiduciary that Grant Sheridan's interest in her was financial. And Emily, who was 19, said something that Walter told me he will hear until he dies. She said, 6 years. And Walter said, yes. And she said, but I was 13. Something began to come apart in her that afternoon, and it was not my doing, and it was not Walter's. It was the sheer arithmetic of 6 years. Because a 19-year-old can absorb the idea that her stepfather is greedy. What she could not absorb was the timeline. The discovery that the man who had been at every school play, who had comforted her about her absent father, who had been so warm, so understanding, so patient, had been reaching for her money since she was 13, which meant that the warmth was not warmth, which meant that all of it, every kind word about her poor busy dad, every sad sigh, had been a man working. And once you pull one thread like that, you cannot stop because your whole childhood is knitted out of it. She said to Walter, and this is the sentence that ended the 8 years, she said, if he lied about that, what else did he lie about? And Walter Ross, that magnificent, rigid, 79-year-old man, still did not tell her. He said, that's not my area. But there is a person who can answer that, and I think you know how to find him. And then he hung up because it was not his story to tell. She did not come that day. It took her 11 weeks, and I have thought a lot about those 11 weeks, and what I think is that she was afraid. Because if she went and looked and found out it was true, then she had spent 8 years being cruel to a man who had done nothing, and the person she had been for 8 years was not a person she wanted to be. Everybody talks about how hard it is to leave a lie. Nobody talks about how much harder it is when leaving it means facing what you did while you believed it. She came on a Thursday in September at about 7 in the evening, and I opened my door and my daughter was standing on my porch, 19 years old, with her mother's chin in my eyes, and she looked at me and she could not speak, and I could not speak either, and we stood there. And she finally said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth even if it's bad. And I said, okay. And she said, why did you stop trying? 8 years. 941 letters. And that was the story she had been given. Why did you stop trying? And here is the thing I want you to understand, the whole reason I told you about those boxes. I did not answer her. I did not defend myself. I did not say, I never stopped for 1 week in 8 years, how dare they? Do you know what they did to me? I did not say any of it because I had learned at that kitchen table when she was 11 that my case was worthless, that a father arguing is just a man arguing. So instead I stepped back from the door and I said, come here. I want to show you something. And I took my daughter into my living room and I turned on the light and I showed her the boxes. 4 cardboard file boxes in a row along the wall where they had been for 8 years. And I opened the first one and I took out the top envelope and I put it in her hands. Her name in my handwriting, her mother's address, postmark from 7 years ago, and across the front, in someone else's writing, return to sender. And I said, every week, since you were 11, that's 941. This one is from the week you turned 12. And then I stepped back and I did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say. It was all in the boxes. I want to tell you what my daughter did then, and it is the hardest thing in this story to tell. She sat down on the floor of my living room, in her coat, and she started opening letters. And she did not stop for 4 hours. She sat on that floor and she read her father's letters to her, in order one after another from age 11 to age 19, and I sat in a chair across the room and I did not say one word for 4 hours because after 8 years of silence I understood, finally, the whole value of it. Every letter she opened was a letter with no argument in it. No defense. No poison about her mother. No case. Just a man telling his kid about his week. The best part of my day today was seeing a dog on the way to work that looked exactly like Rufus. Remember Rufus? I hope your science project went okay. I don't know if it went okay. I hope it did. What was the best part of your day? Week after week. Year after year. Into a void. If I had spent 8 years writing her the truth about Grant, she would have found, that night, 8 years of a bitter man attacking her mother, and she would have closed the box, and she would have gone home, and she would have been right to. Instead, she found her dad. Just her dad, talking to her, for 8 years into nothing, never once giving up, never once getting angry, never once using her. Somewhere around the third box, she stopped being able to read them, and she said, without looking up, in a voice I had not heard since she was 9 years old, my actual daughter's actual voice, not the one they gave her, she said, "You wrote me every week." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "For 8 years. And nobody gave them to me." And I said, "No." And she looked at the boxes, and she did the arithmetic that every child of this particular crime eventually has to do, and I watched her whole childhood reorganize itself in front of me, and she said, "Then everything I know is wrong." And I said, "No, sweetheart, not everything. You were loved the whole time. That part was always true. You just weren't allowed to know it." And then my 19-year-old daughter, who had not touched me since she was 11, crawled across the floor through 8 years of returned mail and put her head on my knee like she was 4, and cried, and I put my hand on her hair, and, God forgive me for what I am about to admit, I did not feel triumphant. I felt sick, because I was holding my child while she grieved a childhood that had been stolen from both of us, and there is no winning that, there is no version of that where anybody won. Grant Sheridan did not take 8 years from me. He took them from her, and she was going to spend the rest of her life carrying it, and I could not give them back to her, and no amount of vindication has ever made that easier. And then, and I have never told anyone this part without my voice going, she lifted her head and she said, "Dad, do you still remember the song? 8 years." And she remembered the song, and I sang it, sitting on the floor of my living room at midnight, a 56-year-old man, singing a stupid made-up song to a grown woman with mascara running down her face, and my daughter laughed, and it was the first time I had heard my daughter laugh since she was 11 years old, and if I never get another good thing in this life, I have that. Let me tell you what happened after, because the reunion was not the end. It was the beginning of the hard part. It did not fix itself. I want to say that plainly, for anybody out there waiting for their own Thursday in September, because the movies lie about this. Emily and I did not simply have our old relationship back. There was no old relationship. There was a 9-year-old and a 19-year-old and an 8-year hole between them where a childhood should have been, and you cannot hug that away. Emily had real, serious grief to get through and real anger, some of which, for a while, landed on me because I was safe, because I was the one who would not leave, and being the safe person means you get the anger that should have gone elsewhere. It took years. It took professional help for both of us, and I want to say that out loud because I spent my whole life being a man who did not do that, and it was the best decision either of us made. And I want to tell you what the hardest part of it actually was, because it was not what I expected. It was not her anger at Grant, and it was not her grief, and it was not even the awkwardness of two strangers learning each other. It was her guilt. It was watching my daughter try to live with what she had done while she believed the story. Because she remembered it all. That is the thing nobody warns you about. She remembered the porch. She remembered exactly what she said to me on her 11th birthday, word for word, better than I did. She remembered the concerts, turning away. She remembered a specific afternoon when she was 15 and a voicemail from me somehow got through and she deleted it without listening while her friends were over, and she made herself tell me about that one, and she could not look at me while she did. And every one of those memories was, for her, a thing she had personally done to her father. She kept saying, "But I was so cruel to you. I was so cruel to you and you just kept writing." And I had to find a way to say the truest thing I know over and over for about 3 years until she could actually hear it, and it is this. She was a child. And she did exactly what a loved, well-adjusted, healthy child does, which is trust the adults who take care of her. That is not a flaw. That is what childhood is. A 9-year-old who believes the grown-ups in her house is not a fool. She is a normal kid, and the fact that the grown-ups in her house were lying to her is a crime committed against her, not a mistake she made. I told her, "You did not reject me, Emily. You were never given the chance to reject me or not reject me. You were handed a story by the people whose entire job on this earth was to tell you the truth, and you believed them, and that was correct. That was the right thing to do. They broke it. You didn't." She could not accept that for a long time. And I understood why, and this is the deepest thing this whole disaster taught me. It is easier for a person to be guilty than to be helpless. If she was guilty, then she had power, then it was her doing, then she could apologize and fix it. If she was innocent, then it meant she had been a child that adults did whatever they liked to, for 8 years and could not have stopped it and had no power at all. Guilt was the more comfortable story. She had to grieve her way out of guilt and into the much harder truth, which is that it was done to her. And there is one more thing I have to say here plainly, because there might be a young person listening. If you have started to suspect you were told a story about a parent that was not true, hear me. It was not your fault. You were a kid. Believing your family is not a sin. And going to find out for yourself at any age, no matter how long it has been, no matter how badly you think you behaved, is never too late, and it is almost never met the way you are afraid it will be. My daughter waited 11 weeks to come to my door because she thought she had spent her welcome. She had a father sitting in a room with 4 boxes for 8 years. We are close now. Genuinely, actually close. But it is a relationship built at 19 and 20 and 25, an adult friendship between 2 people who love each other and who missed each other's whole lives. And it is beautiful, and it is not the thing we would have had, and it never will be. That is the cost. That is what he took. Not money. Time. Diane, my ex-wife, is the saddest part of this story. Because Diane was not a monster. Diane was a person who let a monster do her thinking for her. And when it all came apart, when Emily confronted her mother with the boxes, Diane's defense was the most human and most damning thing I have ever heard. She said she had never actually lied. And it was true. She never had. She had just stayed quiet while other people did because it was easier, because it was convenient, because saying nothing costs nothing today and you can always fix it later, except that you cannot, because 8 years of saying nothing is not neutrality. It is a choice you make 800 times. My ex-wife lost her daughter's trust not because she was evil but because she was a coward, and I have come to believe that in this world, more damage is done by the people who look away than by the people who lie, because a liar needs a room full of quiet people to work in, and Diane was the quiet room. Emily has a relationship with her mother now, a careful, cool, limited one. That is Diane's sentence and she is serving it. And I take no pleasure in it. There was a woman I loved once, and she is in there somewhere under all that convenience, and she threw away the only thing that mattered so that things would not be awkward at dinner. And Grant Sheridan got nothing. That is the part one want you to sit with because it is so much better than revenge. He never got $1. Not one. 8 years of the most patient, sophisticated, cold-blooded campaign I have ever seen. A marriage he did not want, a childhood he vandalized, a false report he made to authorities, all of it aimed at a trust that a dead man had put beyond his reach before he ever appeared, and he walked away with nothing at all. When Emily finally understood what he was, she cut him off entirely, and Diane's marriage did not survive it, and Walter Ross's meticulous 6-year file of Grant's attempts to access a minor's trust found its way, in the end, to the professional bodies that license financial advisors, who take a very dim view of that particular hobby. He is not in prison. I want to be honest about that because people always want the ending where the villain is in chains, and life mostly does not do that. He is just a man in his 50s with no money, no wife, no license, and no idea, I suspect even now, why it did not work, because men like Grant genuinely cannot see the thing they lack. He looked at my daughter for 8 years and saw a trust fund. He never once saw Emily. And that, in the end, was the flaw in the whole design because I saw Emily. And she came home. My name is Ben Archer, and here is the one thing I need you to carry out of this. If someone is turning your child against you, you cannot win them back. I need you to hear that because it is the thing nobody tells you and it will save you years of the wrong kind of fighting. You cannot argue a child out of a story that took years to build. You cannot compete with the person who has them all day, every day. You cannot prove a negative to someone who has been taught to disbelieve you. Every road that leads to winning leads directly across your kid. And if you take it, you will get to be right, and you will lose them anyway, and you will have burned down the thing you were trying to save in order to save it. So do not try to win them. Be findable. That is the whole of what I know. Be the person they can find if they ever come looking, and make sure there is something there when they do. Show up for every visit they cancel. Keep every record. Write the letters that come back. Never say a word against their mother. Not one, no matter how much it burns. Because the day your child finally opens that box, the only thing that will save you is if what she finds inside is not a case but a father. It took 8 years for my daughter to come and ask her question. She could have taken 20. She could have never come at all, and I would have written the letters anyway, and that is not because I am a good man. It is because it was the only move on the board that did not require me to hurt her to make it. Be findable and be the same man in the dark for 8 years that you were in the light, because they can tell your child any story they like. But they cannot tell her a story about 8 years of postmarks. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since that Thursday in September, and I ask it seriously because I do not know the answer and I have had a long time to think about it. If someone spent years turning your own child against you, and you knew that the truth would set your child free but the fight would break her, would you tell her? Would you take the win and pay with her? Or would you do what I did and go quiet and just be there week after week into a silence that might last forever, on the chance that one day she comes and asks? And if she did come, one day at 19, and put her head on your knee and asked you why you stopped trying, what would you want her to find in the box? Tell me in the comments, because there are more of us out here than anyone knows. We are the ones sitting in cars outside houses we are not allowed to enter on birthdays with presents nobody will open. And I want them to hear this tonight from someone who came out the other side. Write the letter. She may never read it. Write it anyway. Keep the box. Because the people who did this to you are counting on you to become the monster they described. And the only thing on this earth that beats an 8-year lie is a man who was quietly, boringly, undramatically telling the truth the entire time with the receipts in a cardboard box waiting for a Thursday in September.